Hello, students. Here we are at the final chapter of the semester. We're going to be looking at Chapter 15, Social Control, Human Rights, Ethics, and the Law. And of course, with this just being one chapter at the very beginning of your program, we are definitely not going to be covering all of the ethics and legal stuff that you will need to know. This is just a very brief overview to cover a number of different topics. And so just know that we're not going to go into too much detail about any of the specific components. And so to start with the therapeutic state. And so the therapeutic state focuses on treatment and rehabilitation of individuals. There is an indeterminate sentences of incarcerations and very restrictive human service settings. This also included involuntary treatment, and each state government had its own requirements that differed sometimes greatly from one another. And obviously we saw these as issues. We saw these as being inhumane, and so some changes needed to happen. And so we looked at this as a human, well, not we, I wasn't around them, but our field looked at this as human rights issues and human services. And so first they discuss, the textbook discusses voluntary versus involuntary services. And that involuntary services can look like a number of different things, but that individuals do have a right to say no and to turn down services. However, some services that we provide are considered involuntary, like maybe they're court ordered, or probation has required them, or the Department of Children and Families. The individual can still say no. There just may be consequences to them not completing the services. But recognizing that there is an important difference between voluntary and involuntary services, and that overall no one can be made to engage in treatment that they don't want. Also, this brought up the issue of due process and equal protection. And so there was the right to be heard in front of, a judge or, a court of law to be determined whether or not the services or treatment is necessary, and if it is unethical or inhumane, and that there should be equal protection for all people, regardless of what their diagnosis may be or what their issues or concerns might be. And so with that, individuals have the right to services to be available. They also have the right to refuse services that they don't want. We should also focus on the least drastic or restrictive alternative. And so immediately when someone has a concern or issue, we shouldn't be talking about inpatient treatment, right? We start talking about maybe outpatient or going into clients' homes, less often. And then if it's more severe, we would look at, or more significant rather, we would look at more restrictive alternatives, but not looking at those right away. We also talk about the privilege of confidential communication. And so what information is to be confidential, how much of it, and confidential within whom. And so there's definitely a lot there. Our textbook, again, just covers a very brief overview of this, but that overall there is confidentiality and only a few circumstances where that confidentiality would be broken. One of those is the duty to warn. And so there's a very famous case, it's called the Tarasoff case, and you will learn more about this if you don't already know it. What that did was set precedent that human service workers and people in our professions, counselors and everything, can warn individuals who might be at imminent risk for danger. And so if we're working with an individual who says, I'm going to go home and I'm going to put my wife in the hospital, or I swear to goodness, I'm just going to kill my boss and I know exactly how I'm going to do it and all of this stuff. You can warn those individuals that there's danger and be covered without being getting into trouble for breaking that confidentiality. And now state to state, those laws differ a little bit. So for example, in Florida, we can warn the individuals and we're covered if we do so, but we do not have to. That is our choice to do so or not to do so. And if we don't warn, we don't break confidentiality, we're also covered. And so that is specific to Florida and some other states, but you want to make sure whatever state you're working in, you understand what the duty to warn is. Kind of related to those things is a Human Service Bill of Rights. And so with each agency that you might work for, if you're in private practice in some way, you should have a Bill of Rights for your clients or the individuals that you serve, the rights that they have as a person seeking services there. And so your textbook goes over very, very general information of what can be included in a Bill of Rights. But some of the things talked about here is that no person shall be compelled to receive services except for safety. People have the right to be free of excessive forms of human modification, so not getting too much more than what they want, and no person shall be subjected to involuntary incarceration or services that they do not need or want. No official sanctions have been applied without the right to a judicial hearing. An involuntary client shall have the right to helping services judged clinically reasonable, and again, not over servicing them. Any compulsory services must be the least required to reasonably safeguard society. So like we do the least restrictive thing to keep others safe, but we don't go overboard, breaking confidentiality or forcing people into treatment that they don't need. Persons receiving involuntary services shall have unimpeded access to legal counsel and relief, so that if they're being given services that they don't need or being overserviced, they can fight that. Individuals receiving voluntary services cannot have involuntary status without due process. And so you can't just say, you came in here voluntarily, but we're going to mandate you to stay unless they're able to go through the judicial system. Individuals' personal information shall not be shared without permission unless it's mandated by the law. So that would be if they're at risk of harming themselves or others, like part of what we just talked about, or if there is an abusive type situation. So what are some ethical standards for human service workers? So first, the human service professional's responsibility to client, statement 1.9 is discussed in your textbook. And then the human service professional's responsibility to the community and society, which is statement 10.21, which is discussed in your text. And these are really important because, we recognize that we have this responsibility to our client and the person that we're working for, but we also have this responsibility to the community and society, which is what makes us mandated reporters of abuse or safety issues. The human service professional also has a responsibility to colleagues. And that's something I've talked about before about recognizing impairment in colleagues. And so, if we see that someone is impaired or biased or, are having their own issues that are impacting their work, it is really important for us to maybe not directly intervene, but maybe get a supervisor involved or something like that. And that's statement 22.25 discussed in your text. The next one is the human service professional's responsibility to the profession. And we talked about this when we talked about advocacy, I think in last chapter. This is statement 26.31 in your text, or stated in your text. This is important that we advocate for the profession, and we also recognize that we're a face for the field. And so anything that we do has a reflection on our field. And so making sure that we're being responsible and professional, and that we also advocate for our profession as a whole. We also have a responsibility to our employers, which is part of what I just discussed with profession, is how do we act professionally and recognize that we may be the face for our employer or agency that we're working for. And that's discussed in statement 32.34. Next is the human service professional's responsibility to self. And so sometimes when we talk about self-care, people think about like, oh, I can just ignore this, it's not a big deal, and kind of brush themselves aside. But recognizing that self-care and having good boundaries and all of that is not just about us, but it's actually a mandate that we're required. It's an ethical standard that we're required to pay attention to. And so that's discussed in statement 35.37. And so in summary for this chapter, the law has direct and indirect impacts on human behavior. The involvement of the judicial system can be really important, right? We want to make sure that people have access to it if they need it. And we know how that the judicial system is kind of playing into involuntary treatment that we might be doing. The therapeutic state and misbehavior, and recognizing the changes that have happened over time because of inhumane conditions and decisions. How we choose to deliver the human services work may look very different depending on the needs of the individuals, and we should look at least restrictive over more restrictive if possible. We discussed the Human Service Bill of Rights in a little bit of detail. There's definitely some more detail in your chapter, but making sure that that is not only something you have, but something you're making the clients aware of. And then finally, that workers have obligations and limits. And so there are limits to what we can engage in, what kind of work we can engage in, but also limits to how much we can do, right? We need to kind of put boundaries and limits on stuff. But then we also have those professional obligations that we talked about again, that are discussed in more detail in the textbook. And so that is it for chapter 15, and that is it for this textbook. Again, I hope that you feel like you learned a lot. We did cover a lot this semester, a lot of which is going to be discussed in more detail in future courses. But this is kind of like a nice broad overview. And so hopefully it'll help you out to have a good basis for as you move forward in the program. And so any questions, just feel free to let me know. And again, make sure you check out the questions before you read the chapter, the thinking questions throughout and the activities, and also any case examples that there might be. This chapter doesn't have a ton of that, but it does have like those different statements and stuff like that written out in it. But you also want to check the end of the chapter for any of those resources, additional readings, and activities that you can do to engage yourself a little bit more in this topic. So that is all for today. Thank you. I hope you have a great final week, excuse me, of the semester, and best wishes on your final exam of the semester.